Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Today we're trekking deep into Lone Star Country, where the woods whisper secrets and every flicker of a lantern could be something more. We've gathered 15 true camping encounters that will haunt your dreams and make you think twice before pitching that tent under the pines. But first, a warning most viewers ignore. If you don't subscribe right now, you'll miss out on our next spine-chilling tale stories so raw they'll leave your skin crawling. Hit that subscribe button and join the brave few who dare to stay for every terrifying moment. Let the darkness begin. A late June breeze wound its way through the stands of pines and maples at Lost Maples, tugging at the tent rainfly until Skylar woke with her heart thudding. She blinked at the milky wash of moonlight filtering through the canopy, every leaf and needle etched in silver. The air smelled of damp pine duff and summer's promise, yet underneath it lay something old and restless, like a wound half-healed. She lay still for a moment, tracing the shape of her friend's sleeping bag across the tent floor. Mara was dead to the world, sprawled on her back, mouth open in a silent snore. Skylar slid out of her sleeping bag, the canvas floor cold beneath her bare feet. She unzipped the door and stepped out into the night, drawn by something she couldn't name. The breeze had taken on a voice, almost a laugh, a tiny tinkling sound that trickled through the pines, too light for human lungs. Skylar paused. The forest fell silent as if someone pressed a giant mute button. She held her breath. Then, from somewhere deeper in the stand of trees came the giggling. Soft, hollow, childlike. Not one child but many, a chorus of stripped-down delight echoing between trunks. She wanted to tell herself it was an owl hunting or the river whispering over shale. But this had a cadence no animal should carry. It was deliberate, punctuated, breathy. She whispered, "Mara?" No answer. The trees held tight. Skylar tiptoed toward the tree line, feet sinking into moss and dead needles. The laughter floated sideways on the breeze, pulling her forward. The further she went, the more she felt the air press in hot and sickly sweet, as though the forest itself were breathing softly in her ear. When she crossed the threshold of pines into the denser stand of maples, the laughter died. All sound drained out, and the moonlight shifted, revealing inky hollows between the trunks. The maples here were older, gnarled like arthritic hands, their branches knotting into unnatural angles. Skylar's flashlight lay back at the tent. She resisted turning on her phone light, as though the forest would recoil if she did. Instead, she let her eyes adjust, straining against the darkness. Then the whisper came. A single syllable, so close it might as well have trailed down her neck. Sky, and it stopped. She froze, mind screaming at her to run, but her feet refused. The next whisper rolled past her, higher in pitch. Sky, Lar. Her breath caught. She forced herself to speak. "Who's there?" Her voice sounded small, shy. The answer was another giggle, staccato and sharp. It came from every direction. She turned, searching for a silhouette, but there was nothing. No shape, no movement. The breeze picked up, stirring leaves overhead. Then dozens of voices, indistinguishable, whispered her name in unison, every. Skylar overlapping like a cold wind rattling through a broken window. She pressed her palms against a maple's trunk. Its bark was scaly and slick with moss. The whispering became a chorus of sighs and soft footsteps circling. Skylar's heart hammered so loud she felt sure it would burst through her ribs. Tears pricked her eyes. She had to get back to Mara, to the tent. She spun away, sprinting through the maples. Branches scraped her arms, and her foot caught on a root. She tumbled headlong into a patch of bracken. Pain shot through her shin, but she scrambled up, sidestepping around trees she thought were closing in on her. The laughter followed, louder. Now the children's mirth dripping like blood. She burst out of the maples into the moonlit clearing. Her flashlight lay where she dropped it. She bolted to it, snatched it up, and clicked it on. The beam sliced a cone of white through the dark. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she trained the light on the pine's edge. Nothing moved. The air was silent, stupidly empty. Skylar flicked the beam across the ground. There, a handful of small handprints pressed into the soft earth in a perfect arc around the maple's border. The soil around them was stained dark, almost wet, though the ground had felt dry beneath her. She swallowed, hands trembling. The prints led toward her tent. She raced back, mind skipping. Every twig snapped behind her sounded like boots. By the time she dove inside and zipped the door, her skin was slick with sweat. Mara snapped awake, eyes wide. "Skylar? What?" she stuttered. "No time," Skylar rasped. "Pack up, we're leaving now." Mara stumbled to her feet, confusion morphing into alarm as Skylar yanked at the tent stakes. The giggling began again, faint but unmistakable. It drifted across the clearing, as close as the zipper on the other side of the canvas. They crawled out, grabbed their packs, and fled across the field toward their car. Skylar clutched Mara's hand so tight her nails cut tracks into her palm. They didn't speak, only ran. Branches whipped at their legs. Pine cones hammered their SHIN dot behind. Them the forest seemed to watch, silent and smothering. No laughter, no whisper, just the rustle of wind through needles, drying the sweat on Skylar's back. When they reached the parking area, the night felt normal again. The distant snarl of highway trucks, the hum of cicadas. They didn't stop, running until the headlights of the Jeep pierced the woods dot inside the car. Skylar fumbled with the keys. Mara's hand shook as she locked the doors. Skylar's foot slammed the ignition. The engine roared. They sped down the gravel drive, tires kicking up dust that glowed in the headlights. Once on the highway, they slowed. Skylar glanced at Mara through the rearview mirror, pale and trembling, her hair matted. "What was that?" Mara whispered. "Skylar." Shook her head, eyes fixed on the dark tree line. "I don't know," she exhaled, a long shuddering breath. "But they knew my name." They drove without speaking for miles until the dark forest lay far behind. City lights appeared on the horizon as a new dawn brightened the sky. Skylar felt the adrenaline fade, replaced by a cold ache in her chest. Days later, she Googled Lost Maple State Natural Area, scouring old papers. A story surfaced about a group of children who vanished in the pines back in the 1950s. One child's laughter heard drifting through the trees, then nothing. The search party never found remains, only shattered branches and a single, tiny handprint. In the mud.skylar closed the browser. The memory of that single whisper still lingered at the back of her mind, a voice that knew her soft as a breeze, insistent as fate. And every night since, when the wind stirs the pines outside her window, she swears she hears them giggle. Mark woke to the subtle tug of the river's breath, a gentle exhale that slipped through the canvas of his tent before dawn. He lay for a moment, half dreaming, lulled by the soft murmur of Guadalupe's current rolling over stones worn smooth by centuries. Beyond the thin barrier of nylon, fireflies danced like distant stars fallen to earth, their pale green lights flickering among cypress knees and twisted live oaks. He inhaled the cold, dew-sweet scent of water and wild mint, stretched one arm toward the dying embers of his campfire, and slipped back into a dream that smelled of wet earth and pine resin. Then came the splashes, 2 or 3, like stones dropped lightly into the shallows. Mark's eyelids fluttered. He convinced himself it was a beaver or perhaps a raccoon, though he had heard beavers slap their tails and raccoons chatter and scuttle, not step. Still half asleep, He counted the pauses between the splashes, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and closed his eyes again. When the steps returned, slow and deliberate, he sat up so abruptly the tent poles groaned, then fell silent. He held his breath and waited. The measured sound of something walking in water grew louder upriver of his campsite, each footfall a muffled thud against gravel bars and submerged logs. He fumbled for his flashlight, thumb brushing the cold metal, and clicked it on. A narrow beam cut through pre-dawn gloom, illuminating reeds shimmering in the current, the sinuous curve of the riverbank, and beyond it, nothing. No animal slinking away. No raccoon frozen at the water's edge. Only the river carrying darkness. Downstream, he swallowed, voice thick with sleep. "Hey, who's there?" His words vanished in the hush. The beam wavered as he swung it upriver, toward a stand of bald cypress whose roots plunged like claws into the floodplain. There was no answer, only the river's whisper, and then, far off, the faintest echo of laughter, childlike but hollow, as if laughter without lips. Mark's heart stuttered. He flicked the light over the campsite, his pack half-zipped. The steel cup set atop a flat rock, the empty fire pit. Something tugged at his gut, an old instinct he had ignored since childhood. Don't turn your back on the woods. He kept the beam pointed at the trees, watching shadows coil between trunks. The laughter drifted again, closer this time, and he thought he heard words. Mark? It sounded like his name, iron-soft, spoken from far away. He stepped out of the tent, boots sinking into damp sand. The chill of the pre-dawn air cut through his shirt, and he shivered, wrapping his arms around himself. He held the flashlight high, its weak cone of light shaking across the moss-draped branches. "Whoever you are, stop messing around." His voice wavered, though he tried to sound calm. No reply, only cicadas beginning their morning chorus. Then, unmistakable, a footstep on dry land just beyond the circle of his beam. He spun, hard hammering, and caught the glint of something white, a flash of bone, perhaps, or pale cloth, before it retreated into shadow. He clicked the light. Across the bank. There, footprints in the soft earth, each the size and shape of a child's shoe, sole pattern faint but deliberate, spaced in regular intervals toward his tent. He closed his eyes, blinked, and the footprints were gone. The river gurgled, impatient, as if mocking him. Mark backed away, tripped on a root, and caught himself against a cypress knee. His flashlight skidded sideways, illuminating a face half hidden behind a low branch. Pale skin, dark eyes too black to reflect the beam, hair plastered to the skull. In wet strands. She wore a dress, ragged, clinging as though soaked, though he had seen no rainfall. She watched him, silent, shoulders hunched, mouth opening and closing as if tasting the air. He stammered, panic pricking beneath his skin. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." He scrambled backward, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The beam flickered, and when it steadied, the girl had vanished. He blinked again. Nothing but trees and that pale ribbon of river. He tasted iron on his tongue. His breath came fast, ragged, echoing in his ears. He thought of retreat, of collapsing into the tent and waiting for day. But something in him forced him forward, a sick curiosity, the same impulse that had brought him to remote campsites alone for years. He needed to know what stalked these woods. He walked toward the place he had seen her, each step crunching twigs, stirring moths into terrified flight. The girl's footprints reappeared in the sand, wet impressions that led upriver. He followed them until they stopped at the crest of a small ravine where the water boiled over hidden rocks. The footprints ended at the edge, as though she had turned and fallen in. He knelt and ran fingers through the grit, felt the imprint of toes and heel knit to this world by pressure and weight. His flashlight beam danced downstream and caught a flash of white drifting beneath the surface. Something heavy, pale fabric, a sleeve maybe, tangled in the current. He grasped a fallen branch and reached into the ice-cold water, fingertips brushing cloth so thin it might have been skin. He jerked his hand back, gagging on the cold. He stood and spun, heart galloping, and the girl was there again, 10 feet away, staring silently. Only now he saw the eyes. Irises the color of river mud, pupils slitted like a cat's. They bored into his chest, and he felt heat crawl across his skin though the air was cold. He flexed his fingers around the flashlight handle and raised it. The girl took a single step forward, and the water rose around her ankles, creeping into the hem of her dress without rippling. She raised a hand, slender fingers pointing at him. And he heard her voice, a bone-deep rasp, "Stay." He bolted. Over the ravine lip, through saplings, stumbling through underbrush until torn branches shredded his shirt and scraped blood down his arms. The flashlight dangled from his hand, beam flickering over roots and ferns. He burst into his campsite, just as the first pale fingers of dawn brushed the sky. He tore at tent pegs, yanked gear into his pack, boots planted in wet sand. Behind him, the river gleamed pink and gold, innocent in the new light. He didn't look back. He ran down the bank, chest burning, until he reached his truck where the engine fire kicked him forward into seat and door. He slammed it shut, locked the doors, and sat panting, listening. No footsteps. No breathing beyond his own. Only the river and the rising sun. He wiped sweat and tears from his eyes, fingers trembling as he started the engine. The road back to town was narrow, curving, through live oaks whose branches arched overhead like cathedral ribs. He drove without stopping, headlights cutting through morning mist that clung to fields and low hills. Only when asphalt gave way to the highway did he dare glance in the rearview mirror. His campsite was gone, no tent, no fire pit, no footprints. Nothing but a patch of damp sand and reeds bending to the current. No sign of the girl or the cloth drifting in the water. He exhaled, shaky, the blood in his ears thudding like a drum. He tried to rationalize heat exhaustion and animal bumping. His tent, a prankster kid from the riverside cabins. But in the days that followed, he couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, the whisper that rolled over his skin like cold water. He stayed indoors at night, listening for water, for footsteps, for laughter. Once he thought he heard a splash. Beyond his back deck saw a ripple spreading across the koi pond. He froze, heart in his throat, then blinked, and the pond was still. He moved away, footsteps echoing hollowly in the house. When he looked back, the reflection in the patio glass was not his own. It was a child wet hair plastered, dressed dark with damp standing knee-deep in his koi pond, head tilted, mouth opening as though to call his name. He slammed the sliding door, threw his weight against it until the lock clicked and turned. The lights on in every room. The reflection stayed in the glass, unmoving, eyes fixed on him. And though he pressed his face close to the door, he could hear nothing but his own ragged breathing and, far behind him, the soft, insistent murmur of water. I remember the way the air tasted that night, a coppery tang, like metal melting into sweat. We slipped our flat-bottomed skiff off the moss-choked dock just as the last vestiges of dusk bled out over Caddo Lake. The water lay flat and slick, a black mirror broken only by the crooked silhouettes of cypress knees and the swaying strands of Spanish moss that draped like ancient shrouds. Maya held the lantern up, its yellow glow flickering across Tyler's face and casting every shadow into sudden relief, sharpening the hollows under his cheekbones until he looked gaunt, almost skeletal. Elena laughed as she splashed the oars, sending ripples across the glassy surface, but the laughter caught in her throat. when the boat drifted into deeper water and the lantern's beam bounced off something dark and unmoving. Something half submerged and impossible to identify. We drifted in silence for a long moment, the only sound the creak of the oarlocks and the chorus of cicadas rising from the swamp. Sam passed around a flask, its metal cold against our palms, and we toasted to bad decisions and better stories. The bayou had a legend for every moonless night. The drowned preacher who still shouted sermons to nobody, the children who chased fireflies and never came home, the lantern bearer who lured travelers into the muck and left only empty boats and echoing sobs. We shrugged it off, young and daring, convinced we'd seen everything until Tyler pointed. Far off, just beyond the circle of our lantern light, another lantern bobbed on the water, drifting closer, then farther away. As if carried by hands we could not see, I called out, voice too loud and brittle in the stillness. "Hello?" The echo died on the black water. Elena gripped my arm, her nails pressing into my skin through my shirt. The lantern wavered, hesitant, and then it moved again slow, deliberate, threading between the cypress knees like a ghostly firefly. We clawed at our paddles, the boat lurching forward as if hungry. I saw reflections in the dark, something that might have been a face, pale and wet, peering from under a brimmed hat. My heart hammered so loud I thought the others must hear it, must feel it. But only the lantern bobbed on, and then, when it drifted too far, something low and guttural echoed across the swamp, a voice that slipped between branches, rich and slow. "Leave now." By then we'd abandoned caution. Maya leaned forward calling, "Wait!" Her words rippled across the water, and the lantern paused, almost imperceptibly, before drifting deeper into shadow. Our boat churned forward, paddles slicing through. The blackness, and every stroke felt like a betrayal, like we were chasing something that wanted us lost. The trees grew denser, leaning in until our lantern's beam could not penetrate their mass. I fumbled for my phone, clicked on the flashlight app, and the harsh white beam cast skeletal trees around us, their branches twisting like grasping. Fingers dot, then the engine sputtered and died, a single cough that echoed in the hush. Panic roiled through us. Tyler yanked the starter cord again and again until the motor gave a final shudder and fell silent. No more lights but ours. No hum. But the frogs croaking in the undergrowth. I realized with a sinking twist in my gut that we were alone on the lake, or perhaps not alone at all. Something moved just beyond our lantern's halo, a wavering shape that sank out of sight when we leaned in to watch. "Elena, did you see that?" I whispered. She shook her head, voice tight. I don't know." Maya's lips pressed together. Sam shifted behind me, his breath ragged. We strained to catch any sound beyond our own panicked breathing. Then the lantern appeared again, closer now, drifting between the knees of an ancient cypress, its light unwavering. As it came closer, I saw it hung from a bent branch, no boat, no hands, just a lantern hovering. The flame inside danced wildly, though there was no wind. I felt a slow, prying dread crawl up my spine when the lantern dipped, as if nodding, as if acknowledging our presence. A soft tapping began at the edge of the hull, deliberate and measured, like nails rapping on wood. I froze, dread twisting my stomach into knots. Tap, tap, tap. It moved around the boat, circling, never louder than a timid knock. Elena whimpered. "We have to leave," she breathed, voice raw. Before I could answer, a low voice rumbled from the water's dark throat. "Leave now." The words seemed to rise from the lake itself, resonant and final. The lantern swung gently, then lifted off the branch and drifted toward the boat. In its dim glow, I saw the faint outline of a figure, tall, shapeless, with dripping hair and hollow sockets where eyes should have been. It reached toward us, arm outstretched, its fingers long and spindly. Maya cried out and lunged for a paddle, swinging it at the apparition. The lantern flared, the flame roared like a scream, and the figure dissolved into motes of dying light. Our boat rocked as if slammed, knocking us off balance. Shouts and curses tumbled from our lips as we fumbled to restart the engine. Finally, with a cough and a roar, it kicked back to life and we sped away, paddles forgotten, as the water slopped over the transom. We didn't care where we were going, only that it was away from that lantern's fickle glow. We crashed into the dock well past midnight, lungs burning and hearts racing so wildly I thought they might burst. We tumbled onto the planks, scrambling up, our hands scraping wood. I dared a glance back and saw the boat drifting, engine still idling, lantern hanging from the bow like a lure. Sam bolted toward the water's edge, shouting, but by the time I reached him, the boat had floated free and drifted into the ink-black current. We could see the lantern bobbing at the far edge of the bayou, smaller now, retreating, until it was swallowed by shadow and gone. We never spoke of what happened after. The cops were useless. No bodies, no crime, no proof of anything but our frayed nerves. We left Caddo Lake at dawn, sun burning off the fog, revealing nothing but driftwood and reeds. The marsh was silent, peaceful, unwilling to testify. Maya buried the lantern in her backyard, deep under the azalea bushes. But sometimes at night I swear I can see its light flicker under the mulch. Tyler sold his share of the boat. Elena moved back to the city. Sam, he started waking up screaming, mumbling, "It wants me back." As for me, sometimes when I drive home down winding country roads, I glimpse a flicker of yellow light hovering in the rearview mirror, drifting along the roadside ditch. And I swear I hear those same two words, carried on a breeze that tastes of rot and regret. Leave now. Colin and Megan slipped through the chain-link gate at Brazos Bend just as the moon dipped behind a curtain of clouds, the warning sign from the park warden still fresh in their memories. Do not use old canoe dock after dark structural damage. It had read in harsh black letters, but tonight the air smelled of toasted marshmallows and dare, and neither of them could resist the pull of that decaying dock stretching into the dark water. They carried a battered metal bucket of coals and a neatly wrapped stack of graham crackers, chocolate squares, and fluffy marshmallows, voices low and breath visible in the chill that slipped off the bayou. The trees leaned in close, Spanish, moss draping like mourners' shawls, and every rustle in the underbrush made Megan's heart catch, but Colin laughed, coaxing her forward, promising her the sweetest s'more she'd ever taste. They found a ring of rusted metal half buried in driftwood at the dock's edge and set their coals inside, piling on dry twigs that sparked to life in a small, hungry flame. The water beneath them lay flat and oil-black, pierced only by blind, half-submerged cypress knees that jutted like teeth waiting to bite something foolish enough to brush past. Megan handed Colin a stick grooved with notches, and he speared a marshmallow, turning it slowly until it glowed golden brown and just a hint of smoke curled from its surface. She watched the firelight dance in his eyes and wondered for a moment why they'd been so eager to tempt fate, why the warden's warning had made them more curious instead of cautious. When the first s'more was assembled gathering graham, chocolate, melting marshmallow into a dripping wedge, they bit at the same moment, and the taste of sticky sweetness exploded on their tongues. They leaned back against the splintered railing, sharing a triumphant grin, until a hollow knock sounded beneath the planks, like someone rapping knuckles against wet wood, deliberate and slow, one tap, then another. Megan froze marshmallow, half chewed, her blood pounding so loud she thought it would drown out the knocking, but the taps continued. Tap. Pause, tap, each one echoing like a heartbeat under the dock. Colin's grin vanished. He put the marshmallow down and shone his flashlight over the water's surface, the beam slicing through blackness. For a moment, nothing moved, except dust swirling in the light until the beam caught a dripping silhouette crouched beneath the dock. Shoulders hunched, one pale hand pressed flat against the wood, fingers splayed wide. The figure's head turned slowly toward them, wet hair plastered to its face, and Colin's stomach dropped. Megan grabbed his arm, choking out a whisper, "Colin," but the flashlight jerked, the figure vanished backward into the gloom with a sound like a soggy rag being dragged across planks. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched and trembled between them, broken only by the crackle of dying embers. They both stared at the dock and then at each other, and Colin tried to shake off the unease. "Probably a branch," he said, but his voice trembled. Megan didn't answer. She felt as if the forest had swallowed its breath. Waiting, they built their courage around the last marshmallow, coaxing the fire to life again, and Megan offered to roast it herself. She inserted the marshmallow on the tip of the stick, held it close to the glowing coals, and watched it swell, skin blistering like a burnt offering. When it was ready, she slid it onto the chocolate and graham. But before she could bite, the knocking came again, right under Colin's boot. He yanked his foot back as if stung, and the marshmallow flew from Megan's hands, splatting on the TV's boards. Sparks from the coals flicked upward, answering the knock with a hiss. Megan scrambled to retrieve the fallen treat, but the wood beneath her fingertips felt alive, pulsing with the rhythm of those insistent taps. Colin inched backward. Toward the shore, flashlight abandoned, the warden's warning cruelly prescient in his mind. "Let's go," he hissed. Megan nodded, but just as they turned to run, the knocking accelerated, rat-tat-tat, fast and frantic, like applause, like panic, like the way dread drums in your chest when you realize you're not alone. Each tap seemed to tighten around their ankles, constricting, pulling them closer to the dock's edge. Megan yanked Colin's hand, but the ground felt soft as mud under her feet, threatening to swallow her whole. They reached the fringe of tall grass and stumbled away, never looking back until Colin froze, yanking Megan down as a shape rose from the water behind them, limbs dripping with scum. Its body twisted unnaturally, a grotesque marionette of soaked flesh and bone, head tilting so the water poured from its hair in rivulets, eyes glowing with something cold and hollow. Megan screamed, a raw, ragged sound that tore through the night, and the creature let out a wet, rasping groan. They ran without thinking, boots thumping through the undergrowth, branches slapping their faces, until they reached the parking lot, where their car sat like a beacon. Megan yanked open the door and dove inside. Colin slammed the lock, dodging a hand that lashed out from nowhere and scraped his jacket sleeve. He sank to the floorboard, panting, heart still hammering, and bent to start the engine. The dash lights flickered weakly, refusing to catch, and in the distance they heard the dock creak, a low, mournful groan that rose to a keening howl as if the entire structure were protesting their escape. Megan pounded at the ignition with trembling fists, and finally the engine caught, lights slicing through the dark. They sped away, tires splashing in puddles, headlights cutting swaths of brightness through the trees. Colin risked a glance in the rearview mirror. There was nothing but empty road and the distant glow of the dying fire on the dock, but in the reflection of the glass he caught a glimpse of something in the back seat, a glint of pale, wet skin, long fingers curled like talons around the edge of the seat behind Megan. He slammed on the brakes, nearly spinning them out, and lunged for the back, yanking at the passenger headrest. Nothing was there, just the stale heat of the car and the faint smell of smoke and charred wood. Megan stared forward, voice trembling into silence, and Colin released a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, but the hair on his arms stayed, prickled with the memory of that knock under the dock. They didn't speak as the highway stretched before them, black as tar, the only sound the engine's low roar. Megan finally reached for Colin's hand, her fingers white on his knuckles, and he held tight, but both of them felt the echo of that hollow tapping, the promise that whatever they'd awakened at Brazos Bend was still following, patient and waiting for them to taste one more s'more. Megan's boots scraped against the jagged stones at the lip of the canyon where the trail dropped off into shadow, and Luis, just behind her, could hear his own breath hammering in his ears, louder than the cicadas that should have been thrumming somewhere beyond sight. But there were no insects tonight, no rustle of wind through the mesquite, no twitter of unseen birds settling for the dark only them and the canyon walls. Slick red rock towering so high they felt buried alive before they even stepped off the beaten path. Megan held up a hand, the motion stiff as her fingers brushed the stone and signaled for Luis to pause. He tilted his flashlight toward the canyon floor, the narrow beam dancing along the ridges and crevices until it vanished in the distance. She traced the curve of the walls, the way they funneled toward a vanishing point where darkness pooled like ink. They joked back at the car about how all sounds would echo down here, how a whisper could bounce back a dozen times. But as they crept forward, voice ready to carry in the emptiness, they found instead an absence so complete it swallowed their words before they left their lips. "Hello?" Megan tried, her voice so soft it trembled, and her breath caught as it died on the windless air, the canyon offering back only the echo of their own beating hearts. Luis lifted his hand, mouthed nothing, hefted his pack heavier on his shoulder, and took the first cautious step down the slope. Megan followed, watching his silhouette against the walls, two figures swallowed by the maw of rock. They edged along a narrow ledge where spindly sagebrush clung to cracks, roots grasping stone like desperate hands. Every crunch of pebbles underfoot sounded unnaturally loud, a drumbeat in the void. Megan tried again, a whisper this time, "Luis?" But the only answer was that oppressive stillness pressing in so close it felt alive, as though the canyon itself inhaled behind their skulls, waiting. She reached out to touch the red sandstone, and felt the surface shiver under her palm, an almost imperceptible tremor as if the rock breathed. She blinked and the tremor was gone. They kept moving, steps measured, shoulders trembling with tension, the beam from their flashlights carving twin slits of visibility in the swallowing dark. Somewhere behind them, a faint click echoed out. Rock dislodging, a branch snapping. They spun, lights crossing each other, illuminating only more stone. "It's just a rock," Luis whispered, and they laughed together, breath ragged, relief mingling with fear. But the laugh died in Megan's throat when the beam caught a shape ahead, a smear of black across the rock, like an oil stain bleeding down the canyon face. She pointed, and Luis crouched for a closer look. It was a handprint, pressed into the sandstone as if someone had slammed against it, fingers splayed like desperate claws. The edges of the print were crisp. Megan swallowed around the sudden dryness in her mouth. Who would leave a print here? They were many miles from the nearest ranger station, and no one camped on these ledges anymore. She touched it, cold as metal, and the rock beneath her fingertips thrummed once, sharply, like a heartbeat skipped. She yanked her hand back and almost screamed, yet no sound emerged, the silence swallowing even terror. Luis stood, voice taut. "We should go." Megan nodded, feet suddenly heavy. They turned, retracing their steps, but the trail had shifted. The canyon walls, once looming parallel, now leaned inward, narrowing the path until it vanished beneath a jagged overhang. Their lights converged on the darkness ahead, and for a moment it seemed as though the walls had drawn closer behind them, pressing forward until they could barely breathe. Megan's heart pounded so loud she feared Luis would hear it and might never believe what had happened when he asked later. She swallowed, raised her hand to call out, but the quiet held its ground, an impossible vacuum devouring her voice. Behind them, a sound very faint, like distant cotton tapping against rock echoed through the gorge. Megan froze. Louise froze. Their lights swung back and forth, seeking its source. It came again. Tap, tap, tap. Rhythmic. Measured. Impossible to locate. The tapping kept time with Megan's pulse, and something deep in her chest told her that sound wasn't made by human hands. Run, Louise breathed, and they bolted, stumbling over stones, pressing through a narrowing gap until Megan's shoulder. Scraped wet rock and a trickle of cold fluid slid down her arm. They plunged through the gap and burst into open space on the canyon floor, the walls retreating as though they'd opened a mouth, letting them slip free. They didn't stop running until the moon sat high above the edge, bathing the sandy wash in pale light. Megan leaned against a boulder, gasping, while Louise swept the flashlight over her arm. The smear of red on her sleeve gleamed under the beam. Blood? She looked down. The rock had cut her, a shallow gash, but her fingerprints were missing, the skin where she touched the handprint. She stared, shaking. What did we just leave behind? She whispered. Louise said nothing. They pressed on, legs pumping through sand so fine it sucked at their feet. Behind them, the gorge yawned, empty except for the reverse echo of their footsteps, and the silence followed, trailing them like a shadow. At the rim, they found the trail again, familiar, but it sliced off sharply in a direction neither remembered. Megan pointed down the path they hadn't come. Louise grabbed her arm. No, he said. They both knew they would die trying that way. But turning back meant facing the canyon and its living silence. Neither spoke. The canyon walls stretched on to infinity under a black sky littered with stars, and the hush buried every thought, filling their minds with the void. Megan closed her eyes. She could feel something shifting inside the quiet, a presence moving along the rim where the rock met the sky, too slow to be a bird, too deliberate to be wind. She opened her eyes. Luce's flashlight lay at their feet, flickering. He leaned down to grab it, and Megan caught his arm too late. A low rasp like 1,000 fingernails dragging against stone filled the air, and Luce's flashlight skittered across the sand, spinning until its beam landed on the canyon wall behind him. There, in the pale light, dozens of handprints lined the rock, ascending like the residue of some grotesque baptism. Megan realized those prints were too small, too slender to be human. They glowed faintly where touched by moonlight, pulsing once like a heartbeat. She screamed, a raw animal cry, and Louise whirled, reaching for her, but the fisherette there. Back snapped shut with a thunderous rumble, the walls sliding together until only the circle of moonlight remained. And in that circle, the prints crawled upward, inch by inch, toward Megan and Louise, fingertips splayed, reaching for the living, beckoning them into the silence that demanded company. Megan squeezed her eyes shut, held Luce's hand, and let the hush finish their sentence. When the wind finally whispered through Palo Duro Canyon again, the fresh stones lay smooth and unbroken. The night as quiet as it had always been save for the faint echo of two voices swallowed whole, lost to the walls, carried into eternity by the silence that lived between them. The sun sank low behind the cedar-strewn rim of Inks Lake, turning the water a bruised indigo that swallowed sound. Jenna sat on the weathered planks of the old canoe dock, her legs dangling over the edge, boots just brushing the cold, glassy surface. She'd driven hours from Austin to escape. The cramped apartment, the stifling memories, the ache of another failed love. Here, the world felt expansive, silent except for the whisper of wind through bald cypress and the distant croak of frogs. She closed her eyes, leaning back on her palms, trying to let the quiet fill the empty spaces in her chest. When she opened them, the sky had dimmed to a deep violet and the lake mirrored the first dull stars. She watched her own reflection, pale face framed by tawny hair, drift against the water's skin. But then something shifted. The surface curved as if a stone were skipping beneath, but there was no splash. Ripples fanned outward, blurring her features until the face staring back at her wore eyes too dark, too knowing. Jenna frowned, leaning forward, breath catching. The surface smoothed, and the reflection was hers again, though her heart pounded in her throat as though something had tapped her shoulder. She stood, boots scraping wood, and as she did the ripples froze mid-wave. The lake held its breath, as if waiting. Jenna's pulse thundered in her ears. She backed off the dock and turned to gather her jacket, intending to head back up the trail to her cabin. The moment her foot hit solid ground, the ripples resumed, spreading toward the shore, racing to drown her reflection in a widening haze. She stopped, transfixed, and the ripples slowed, retreating until her water-world twin sat motionless again, eyes locked on hers. Later, in the cabin, Jenna paced by the window, curtains half open to let in night air. The forest beyond loomed, in black silhouettes. Lightning bugs winked at random, like tiny lanterns suspended in darkness. She'd never been one to believe in ghosts or curses, but the image of those alien eyes burned in her mind. Sleep drifted over her like a fever, and she dreamed of drowning, of water burbling through her throat, of a voice whispering, "Stay." Morning light revealed dew-glazed pines and the lake shining silver. Jenna drank coffee on the porch, refusing to count the time she glanced at the dock below. Something in the hush felt strained, as if the world were holding back a secret. She shivered and added another log to the stove, telling herself it was just nerves. After breakfast, she grabbed her camera and headed down to photograph the trail, maybe distract herself, maybe prove that Inks Lake was just a pretty place. No malevolent spirits hiding beneath its placid surface. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, soothing in its familiarity. She snapped pictures of moss-laced limestone outcrops and the sun piercing through canopy. But when she crested a bend and saw the dock, framed by autumn gold leaves, her heart lurched. There, on the planks, sat her reflection once more, though she was 50 feet away, crouched among ferns. The face rippled with a smile that didn't match her frown. She raised the camera, lens zoomed in, but when she peered through the viewfinder, the reflection was gone. Hands trembling, she lowered the camera. A distant splash made her whirl around. Nothing moved except a jitter of small waves at the opposite shore. Jenna swallowed and forced laughter. "Get a grip," she muttered. Still, she noticed each time she moved, ripples fanned out like someone else's footsteps on water. If she walked left, the ripples emerged right. If she turned, they paused, then restarted, chasing after her in silent imitation. By the third night she heard it, a gentle tapping, like knuckles rapping on damp wood. She lay in bed, listening, racked by every snap of twig and rustle of leaf. The tapping grew louder, thrumming an uneven rhythm beneath her window. She held her breath until it stopped, then darted from the cabin with one hand pressed to her pounding chest. Outside, she tasted ozone on the breeze. Moonlight glinted off unreal shapes in the water. She crept to the dock's edge, every footstep loud. When she looked down, she saw not one reflection but two. Her own, and beside it, a shadowy twin whose head tilted in curiosity. Jenna gasped and stumbled backward, foot catching on a root. She caught herself, back stiff, eyes locked on the dock. The twins' faces melted into darkness as the second shadow sank into ripples of ink. Over the next day, Jenna scarcely ate. She wandered the shore, listening for that tapping, that whisper. At dusk, she tried to call someone, family, friends, but her phone showed no bars. The warmth of connection was gone. The world had slipped away and left her stranded at this cursed edge. She stood at water's lip, heart heavy, and whispered, "What do you want?" The lake shimmered, answering with perfect stillness. Night fell in a wash of black, complete and suffocating. Jenna carried a lantern down to the dock, its weak glow tremoring against the dark. She set it on the boards and sat beside it, knees pulled to her chest. The window of light made a small island in the void. Whatever thing waited would have to come through that glow. She stared at the lantern, willing courage into her bones, when she heard it. Slow, deliberate footfalls on. Wood dots she peered out. The dock looked empty, but the lantern light was wavering as though moved by a breeze. Jenna leaned forward, and in the lantern's glow she saw him, a figure taller than her, translucent, stepping toward her. The face was hers, but elongated, twisted into a grin that felt like broken glass. Jenna scrambled back, lantern toppling to the boards, flame dancing in a hiss of propane. She retreated off the dock onto the shore, but the figure followed, each footstep leaving a damp print. On the dirt, she ran, lungs burning, into the night, guided by trembling moonlight through trees that caught her like fingers. Branches clawed at her shoulders, knocking the lantern from her hand, extinguishing the last light. In the sudden black, she felt a cold breath against her neck, smelled her own hair, heard her own laugh, except it rattled inhumanly. She stumbled and fell, panic turning her vision to stars as she pressed face first into moss. A voice, soft and intimate, whispered, "I see you." Then a hand, slim and wet as algae, clamped over her mouth. Jenna's scream was strangled. She fought, kicking, tears stinging her eyes, but the hand tightened. In her periphery she saw pale skin against the dark, the reflection's face inches from her own, eyes as empty as the lake at dawn. Jenna pried the fingers away and bolted upright, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst her ribs. She ran and ran until the forest thinned, cresting a hill to the ranger's cabin, lights blazing. She pounded the door with shaking. Fists dot the ranger. A squat man with a flashlight opened his door and peered at her, frightened. Jenna tried to speak, tears and words tumbling together. "Something's in the lake," she gasped. "It my reflection, it came for me." The ranger's eyes widened and he reached for his radio. "I need backup at Inks Lake Dock. Female, possible hypothermia, hysterical." And something else, she says something came out of the water. By morning, they searched the dock. The lantern and boots were gone. Jenna was nowhere to be found. The water lay calm, a perfect mirror under pale sky. Rangers dragged nets and probed with poles, but found nothing. No trace of splashed footprints, no lantern glass, not even a scrap of coat. In the faint light, the lake looked innocuous, as though nothing had happened. One ranger peered down at his reflection and frowned, noticing his eyes looked darker, more hollow. He blinked and the surface rippled, though no wind stirred. The other rangers swore they heard laughter, soft and echoing, as the lake exhaled and settled back into stillness. Noah shouldn't have come out this far, not alone, not at night. The highway's glow had faded behind him like a dying ember, and now the only light was a swollen sliver of moon, washed pale and ghostly through thin clouds. He pressed his boot into sandy soil, and the grit crunched beneath him, the echo swallowed by desert silence. Ahead, mesquite limbs loomed like waiting arms, and clusters of sharp yucca bristled at odd angles, their leaves glinting silver in the pale light. He raised his flashlight, and its beam cut a path through the scrub, illuminating pitted rocks and scattered tumbleweeds. The land stretched empty as a tomb. Then he saw it, a shape darting between trunks, a living shadow that skittered just beyond. Reach. Every muscle clenched, he lurched forward, breath ragged, heart hammering. The desert air tasted of dust and creosote, thick with the promise of something watching. He stalked after that silhouette with trembling hands wrapped around the flashlight, every instinct screaming to turn back, but curiosity hunted him onward. He remembered why he'd come. 2 nights ago, the old radio station had played a recording from a hiker lost in these hills decades earlier, a man who vanished without trace at an abandoned ranch somewhere east of here. The announcer claimed he'd caught a glimpse of something. Moving amid mesquite, something that waited by a rusted gate, its shape too black for any ordinary beast. Friends laughed it off, said it was desert wind playing tricks. But Noah felt a tug in his chest, a kinship with the lost man's final. Terror. He'd spent weeks poring over maps and listening to scratchy transmissions, driven by a restless need to see it himself. When he got to the gravel turnoff at mile marker 77, he felt the air grow colder, the way it does before a storm, though no storm was coming. Now, standing under the high, empty sky, he realized the desert had its own storms once. That pounded the flesh and shook the mind. The silhouette slipped behind a dead cottonwood, and Noah bolted around its trunk, flashlight bobbing. The beam fell on nothing but sand and scrub, then caught on something half-buried. An old horseshoe, rust crusted over, pointing like an omen. He stooped, touched the cold metal, and his fingertips went numb. A soft tap echoed behind him like knuckles rapping wet wood, and he swung the light toward the sound. There, just beyond a barbed wire fence, an abandoned ranch gate stood swinging on one hinge. The boards were fractured, the metal latch rusted through. And on the other side, frozen under moonlight, was the shadow. No features, no shape beyond. A dark outline, as if someone had poured ink around a man and let it set. It didn't move, but its presence weighed on Noah's lungs like lead. He crossed under the fence, slipping through a gap where a post had rotted away. The desert hush turned oppressive. All he could hear was his own pulse in his ears. His flashlight revealed the yard. A corral caved in on one side, a rusted trough filled with stagnant water, and the low silhouette of a single-story house staring at him, windows torn out like hollow eyes. "Hello?" he called, voice flat and brittle. He swallowed, and the sound echoed in the darkness, swallowed by the wind. The shadow stood still, as though waiting for him to choose. He hesitated, then advanced. Every step smelled of decay rotting. Wood, animal droppings, the coppery tang of dried blood. The shadow didn't flinch. It stayed there, waiting. At the porch, the floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He swept the beam across a broken window, the glass shards catching light. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, rotted furniture, cracked tin cans, a tattered children's shoe. He paused at the shoe, half buried in sand, and remembered the radio story of footprints leading away from the gate, tiny prints that vanished at the porch. He crouched and brushed the grit aside, nothing. But at the edge of the porch he saw prints in the dust, large, barefoot, oddly spaced, like someone had stood there for minutes on end. They led off toward a low hill beyond the house. The wind whispered through the broken rafters, carrying an almost speech, a soft hiss that might have been words, might have been wind singing through the cracks. He stood and scanned the night. Heart pounding. The shadow was gone. For a moment he felt relief, absurd relief, until the beam caught it again, perched at the crest of the hill, limbs unnaturally still, as if carved from midnight itself. Noah swallowed, spine prickling. His breath came shallow, stuttered. He wanted to laugh nervous laughter, but his throat locked up. He lifted the flashlight and began to walk toward the hill, each step dragging him deeper into that silent world. The ground sloped up, loose stones sliding underfoot. The shadow waited without movement, and when he got within 20 feet, he realized its head was tilted, as if studying him. He swallowed hard, and the wind died, leaving a hollow silence that hurt his ears. "Why are you here?" he asked, voice cracking. The shadow stayed still, but then a thin finger, impossible, inhuman, lifted and pointed back at the gate. Noah's flashlight flickered, nearly went out, then returned. He looked past the shadow and saw, on the far side of the yard, a tilt of something white against the dark, a pale hand gripping the gate. The boards rattled as though someone or something stood there, waiting to let itself in. He turned, back to the shadow. It seemed to flicker, ripple, like a curtain in a breeze. And for a heartbeat, he thought he saw a blurred face pressed to that shape, eyes hollow wells. He stumbled back, tripped on a rock, cursed as he fell to his hands. Standing up, he shone the beam wide. The shadow on the hill was gone. The ranch gate creaked softly, swinging open to admit a figure that stepped into the yard. It was a man in threadbare jeans and a shirt stained dark, face slick with sweat and dust, eyes too wide, too bright under the moon. He looked at Noah and tilted his head. "You shouldn't have come," he said, voice ragged as gravel. Noah raised his flashlight and the beam caught the man's features, skin stretched too tight, veins black and pulsing, lips split and raw. There was no recognition in those eyes, only hunger. Noah backed away. The man moved forward, each step measured, deliberate, feet sinking into sand. "I've been waiting," the man murmured. "Waiting for someone to chase me." His lips twisted into something like a smile. At that moment the wind came back, whipping sand through the yard, rattling the broken shutters. Noah turned to run, but his legs refused. The ground beneath him pulsed, trembled, and he realized with a sick lurch that the earth here did not want him to leave. He stumbled, tried again, and fell. When he looked up, the man was gone. The gate swung shut with a clang that reverberated through Noah's chest. He forced himself up, shaking, and sprinted toward the fence. His flashlight beam danced frantically, illuminating the gate just as he leapt, catching on rusted wire that snagged his jacket. He yanked free, tearing the fabric, and tumbled into the scrub on the other side. He ran without looking back, navigating by the moon and his own ragged breath. Coyotes howled somewhere far off, and the mesquite branches snapped and grazed his arms as though reaching to drag him back. He burst onto the gravel road, throat raw, lungs burning. His car sat 100 yards ahead, headlights off, windows dark. He sprinted toward it, falling against the door, fumbling the key. The engine roared to life, tires spinning gravel, and he slammed it into drive. Through the rear window he thought he saw movement, a dark figure standing at the gate, perfectly still, watching him go. He didn't slow until the highway lights swallowed the desert behind him. That night, alone in a cheap motel room, he lay awake listening to his pulse. In the bathroom mirror he saw, behind his own reflection, something dark leaning in. He spun. Around nothing. When he looked back, the mirror held only him, tired and hollow. He turned away, flicked off the light, and slid under the covers, shivering. Outside, a shadow touched the window pane. It waited, and Noah realized with a cold certainty that sometimes what you chase in the dark chooses to follow you home. They said Enchanted Rock was haunted, but that was just legend until the night we camped at its base. A half-moon slivered in the sky and the scent of juniper riding the breeze. I remembered the way the granite glowed pale under starlight, like a giant moon tethered to the earth. Lucas, Sarah, and I had pitched tents on that rocky plateau where the lichen clung like mossy scars, and the wind whispered hollow through cracks in the stone. The park ranger warned us not to climb the dome after dark, said the spirits of the Tonkawa prowled those heights, but we laughed it off, drunk on cheap beer and the bravado of youth. Around midnight, Sarah woke me, eyes wide, pointing at the ridge above our camp. I squinted into the darkness and saw a shape, a man standing motionless on the summit, his silhouette etched against the faint glow of town lights nearly 10 miles away. He didn't move an inch, as though he'd been carved from the granite itself. Sarah blinked, then blinked again, and when she opened her eyes, the figure was gone. We shrugged it off as fatigue, but none of us slept well after that. Don Lucas was the first to wake, the horizon awash of pink and gold, and he was staring up at the ridge, mouth hanging open. "There," he whispered, voice cracking, and we tumbled out of our tents to see what he saw. There was no one there, only sun-bleached stone and the slow drift of morning mist catching in gullies. Lucas's eyes flicked down and he pointed. Shaking, a series of footprints, large and booted, pressed deep into the granite, leading down the slope toward our campsite. Each print was crisp, as if pressed only moments ago, but where they met the soil of our tent area, they vanished, disappearing at the edge of the canvas like some creature had melted into the ground. We followed them in silence, the crunch of gravel under our boots sounding absurdly loud until we reached the place where the prints stopped. Sarah looked up, voice trembling. "But there's no path from here." We scrambled toward the ranger station, hearts pounding in our chests, and breath coming hard. By the time we slammed the door and the rangers stirred awake, gasping at our wild-eyed faces, we were stumbling over our words. He grabbed his flashlight, shoved us into his truck, and drove us back to the ridge. The footprints were still there, clear as morning dew. 6 prints like an uneven ladder in the rock, then nothing. He knelt beside the first, ran a finger through the dust of granite sand, and frowned. "That's not from any boot we issue," he muttered, but when he spoke again, the prints had vanished, as if the rock itself had swallowed them whole. By then the sun was higher, burning off the mist, and the world looked ordinary again, but none of us felt safe. We camped one more night, too afraid to leave, and that evening the air went cold and still, so silent it felt like the world was holding its breath. Sarah swore she heard footsteps on the ridge again, soft at first, then a deliberate knock like knuckles rapping on the stone over and over, slow and measured. "It's calling," she said, voice low. Lucas laughed nervously, but his smile died when the ridge answered in kind, 2 more taps, then 3, then 4, as though someone shifted position. Behind us, the trees shivered, and I thought I saw movement where there should have been none. We spent our last hours sitting huddled in the dark, trading stories to keep our minds busy, but every tale ended with a glance up the dome, where at any moment a figure could appear, tall and still. About midnight, Sarah slipped away, said she was going to use the latrine and might be gone a while. Emma and I waited, worried, but Sarah always took her time, so we didn't rush to look. When she didn't return after 10 minutes, Emma's worry turned to panic, and we grabbed our flashlights and called her name into the night. Our voices echoed off the granite, but for a long time there was no answer. Then, faintly, we heard her laugh, soft, distant, like someone calling from too far away. We raced toward the sound, flashlights bobbing. The laughter led us upslope to a ledge we'd never noticed, a narrow bench carved into the rock. We shone our beams across it and saw her sitting there, legs dangling over the edge, her face tilted up toward the sky, mouth parted in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Come up," she beckoned, voice flat. "It's beautiful up here." Emma grabbed my arm. "She's not Sarah," she hissed. But Sarah's face was pale, almost luminescent under the moon, and her eyes were emptier than I'd ever seen. We called again, louder, but at that moment the shape appeared behind her, the man on the ridge, stepping from shadow into moonlight, tall and lean, wearing a dark coat that fluttered like feathers in the wind. He slid onto the bench next to Sarah, and they sat side by side, perfectly still. I don't remember climbing up there. I only recall Emma's scream and the rush of wind carrying a high keening note. Then darkness. When I came to, dawn was breaking and I was alone. Emma and Sarah were gone. My flashlight lay shattered at my feet. I staggered back to camp, legs. Numb, mind whirling. We had 2 tents, both empty, everything inside undisturbed except for a single boot print pressed into the ground. Between them, too large for any of us. Rangers found me wandering the trail hours later, eyes glazed, murmuring. About a man on the ridge. They searched the rock until their radios crackled with nothing but static, then backtracked to my camp and found my bag still zipped. My journal opened to a half-written page. He's here, he's calling, and I can't. The rest was torn away. No trace of Emma or Sarah ever surfaced. The missing persons team chalked it up to wild animals or someone getting lost at night, but I know what I saw. Now, years later, I can't drive past Fredericksburg without my heart hammering. Sometimes in the mirror I catch a shadow at the edge of my vision, tall and still, standing in the back seat. And sometimes I awake before dawn, gaze through the window, and see a footprint on my front porch, leading nowhere. Eli and Mia woke to the river roaring angrily, though it had been gentle hours before. They lay frozen in the narrow sleeping alcove of the cabin, the thin walls trembling with a deep vibration that felt less like wind and more like an earthquake, humming beneath their lungs. Mia pressed her cheek into the scratchy wool blanket and listened, heart hammering, as the roar grew into a jagged crescendo that ripped through the pride-on stillness like a freight train carrying thunder. She nudged Eli's shoulder. He cracked one eye open and coughed, startled by the noise that seemed to rise from an impossible depth. The window's glass rattled, and then with a shuddering crash they heard wood splinter and the cabin support beam groan in protest. They scrambled out of their sleeping bags, voices caught in their throats, as the second floor shuddered beneath them and the floorboards flexed like living things. By the time they reached the porch, the sky was bruised, violet, and the river had swollen into a furious mass of churning gray water that slammed against the pilings. The bank they had strolled along last night, tossing stones at minnows, had vanished. In its place was a ragged cliff of earth riddled with tree roots, the soil sheared off in a clean arc that looked almost surgical. Fat drops of rain cold and sudden began to patter against the tin roof, and the wind carried the stench of wet clay and rotting wood. But what froze them harder than the storm was the single line of wet footprints that led away from the broken bank and into the dense tangle of hill country beyond, human in shape, but oddly uniform, as if stamped by an unsteady machine, each heel pressed into the mud with mechanical deliberation. The prints vanished into a thicket of mesquite and yaupon holly, where spiny branches writhed like blackened veins under the dark sky. Mia shivered and swallowed, tasting the metallic hint of fear rising in her mouth. "They're going out there," she whispered. Eli shook his head, cold leaking into his bones. "We don't know what?" He stopped himself as a low, guttural howl echoed through the ravines, a sound that slipped beneath the roar of water and rattled their teeth. It was a long, keening groan, and it ended with a ragged inhale that didn't sound entirely human. Mia swallowed. "That's not them," she said. "They had invited no one else. Yesterday, the sun had sparkled off the river, and they had laughed as they skipped stones. Now, everything felt twisted, as though reality had curled inward overnight." Eli knelt beside the first footprint on the bank, a shallow crescent with a crushed heel, like someone had rubbed at the mud with care. He traced a fingertip along the edge and recoiled as the cold water seeped into his skin. "Look," he said, eyes wide under the circling storm clouds. Streaks of muddy red marked the heel of the print, as if something had dragged a smear of blood from somewhere deeper into the river. They followed the trail in silence, flashlight beams dancing over leaves slick with rain, their breaths puffing out like ghosts in the damp gloom. Each step revealed another print, and every print hinted at a story they did not want to imagine. The woods pressed in around them, dense with chinaberry and yapon, so thick that the moon strained to cast anything but a pale fuzz of light. Fox cries punctuated the distance, and something skittered through underbrush, leaving a rustle that made their hair stand on end. They rounded a bend where the land rose into a steep bluff, and the footprints halted abruptly at the mouth of a cave so dark it might have been carved by nightmares. The howl came again, closer this time, a sound laden with pain and anger, as though something trapped inside was clawing at its own throat. Mia gripped Eli's arm, knuckles white. "We shouldn't," she began, but the wind snatched her. Words. He shone the light into the cavern's mouth and caught a glimpse of a mottled stone floor, slick and shining, pooling into shadows that pulsed with something alive. "Please," he murmured, but neither moved closer. The footprints ended there, as though the thing that made them had simply melted back into the earth. A sudden crack echoed from within the cave, like a bone snapping in two, and the howl spiked into a primal shriek that rattled the rock walls. Fear peeled through them, raw and blinding. Mia's voice came in a strangled whisper. "Let's go back." They stumbled away, boots catching on roots, lungs burning with cold air. But as they fled, the river's roar seemed to follow, swelling in their ears until it drowned out every thought. When they burst back onto the stripped bank, the river was a living wall of water, and in its churning depths, Mia spotted a shape. A pale lump, half submerged, drifting against the current like a ragged mannequin. It bobbed in and out of sight, entwined in branches and mud, and she let out a strangled gasp. Eli shone his light and froze. The shape lingered at the edge of the breakers, and for one breathless moment they both saw the face eyes glassy and unseeing, mouth twisted into a frozen grimace. The thing moved closer, raked by a submerged log, and fell away again. "God," Eli breathed. Mia pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. The body slipped beneath the waves, and the river swallowed it whole, leaving nothing but a swirl of foam. The storm broke then, as though the sky had finally torn open, and rain blasted down, stinging their faces. They dropped to their knees, cold creeping through their clothes, and when lightning split the sky they saw footprints where none had been moments before, smaller prints, like child shoes, weaving closer to the cabin, trailing behind them. As if curious, Mia's mind shrieked. They turned to sprint back to safety, but the earth dropped away beneath her foot. She tumbled once, then slammed into Eli, and they both rolled to a stop at the cliff's edge, gasping. Below them, the new bank was gone, the river lapping at the remnants of the cabin's porch posts. "We need to climb," Eli said, voice tight. They scrambled up the rise, branches slashing at their faces, hearts pounding in unison with the thunder. At the top, the forest floor gave way to a narrow ledge that wrapped around the bluff. They followed it, feet slipping on wet shale, until they reached a stand of cedars where the air tasted of resin and something older, something watching. There, pressed against the trunk of a cedar, was a single red glove, the tiny kind a child might wear. Mia knelt and picked it up by the wrist, careful not to touch the gummy stain that darkened the fingertips. The glove was warm, as if freshly torn from a hand, and as she held it a rasping whisper drifted through the trees. "Stay." They spun, but saw only gnarly branches and shadows that flickered like restless spirits. The whisper came again, closer, and their blood felt like ice. Eli grabbed Mia's hand and pulled her from the cedar grove, stumbling through brambles until they tumbled out onto a rocky spur that overlooked the river. The water below was unsettlingly calm now, a wide mirror reflecting the ragged edges of hill country under a cracked sky. The roar had faded, replaced by a sinister hush that swallowed every sound but their ragged breathing. Behind them, deep in the woods, the whisper rose into a chorus of voices, childlike laughter, desperate cries, and that same inhuman howl woven together in a mad hymn. Mia dragged Eli to his feet. "Run," she hissed. They fled along the ridge, the voices chasing them through the darkness, until the cabin's lantern light winked through the trees, a solitary beacon. They burst through the door, slamming it shut, and lunged for the wall-mounted lamp. As Eli lit it, their flashlight flickered out, and the cabin fell into an amber glow that trembled against the windows. Mia pressed her back against the door, breathing so hard she thought her lungs would burst. "Are you okay?" Eli's voice cracked. She nodded, eyes wide. But then she saw footprints on the wooden floor, small and uniform, matching the glove's size, leading from the door toward the hearth. Her eyes snapped to Eli's coat rack. His jacket lay discarded on the hook, empty. He reached to pull it on, but froze as he saw the sleeve, slick with mud, dangling beside an empty glove that matched the one Mia held. His hand trembled, and he looked at her, mouth opening without words. Behind them, a soft pitter-patter began, wet steps crossing the porch, pacing like someone circling the cabin, waiting. Mia dropped the glove. It fell with a soft slap, and the silence that followed was worse than the storm. The rain has stopped, the river has gone still, and outside something waits. The sun was a low, amber smear behind the thick stands of loblolly pines when I first heard it, soft, mournful, like the sigh of an old man lying down to die. We'd set up our recording gear in the clearing just off Old Railroad Road, hoping to capture nocturnal wildlife, the rustle of deer in the underbrush, the distant hoot of owls. Instead, half an hour after sundown, the whistle slithered out of the pines, an impossible, pristine note that floated between the trunks, then faded as if swallowed by shadows. We paused our chatter, headphones pressed tight, but the woods fell. Silent again, as if ashamed to admit the sound had ever been there. My partner Marisol tapped the time code on her recorder. Precisely 30 minutes passed. I shrugged, joked that someone was out in the thicket with a flute, but my smile hit a wall of unease that I couldn't shake. When it came again at 1, then 1:30, boat bell clear. I knew it hadn't been a person. We came back the next night, curious, recording the same spot from 3 angles. A lav mic hidden in the undergrowth, a parabolic dish trained at the dark tangle of pines, a handheld recorder laid on a rotting stump. 30 minutes after dark, the whistle arrived, soft and slow, a tune so pure it made your chest ache. Marisol grinned into the gloom. "That's impressive," she said, as if complimenting a concert pianist. We played it back. The recorder spat out a warped lullaby, childlike notes pitched too low, drawn into a cavernous echo that ended in a strangled, rasping sigh, and then a laughter like brittle bones cracking. We abandoned the site, hearts racing, convinced the machines had glitched. But the third night we found footprints. Small, barefoot impressions in the damp loam, trailing from the edge of our clearing toward the deeper forest, vanishing where? The ground rose to an old fire break. No adult could have left marks so delicate. They were no larger than a child's, all toes and arch, pressed as if someone had stepped lightly to avoid waking the trees. We followed until the underbrush closed. And we turned back, breath misting in the gloom. A distant call of a whippoorwill, but the whistle was gone. We brought more people on the 4th night, an acoustic engineer named Torres who swore by spectral analysis. We spread the mics wider, set time-lapse video cameras pointing into the Biomoida thicket. We weren't eager to debunk. We wanted to understand. At midnight, multiple channels recorded the whistle in perfect sync, the dish and lav mics catching it like lightning in a bottle. On playback, though, the dish feed trembled, the notes slowing until they fell into a murmured lullaby. Then darkness, 31 seconds of nothing in that breath, the guttural sigh of something ancient exhaling, followed by a laughter that crawled inside your skull. We froze, emptying sweat onto the controls. Therese said, "What the hell is that?" And I thought, we're about to find out. Against every rational instinct, we trekked into the forest the next morning, following the path that snaked northward alongside a dry creek bed. The pines towered, needles carpeting the floor, the air sweet with resin and rot. The footprints reappeared where the creek split around a fallen log, crossing damp earth toward a stand of trees marked by crude carvings, deep gouges that spelled no words, but felt like blurred scratches of desperation. We circled them, fingers tracing the grooves until a faint whistle curled between the trunks. We froze, hearing the same note we'd recorded, only here it sounded raw, immediate, as if it flickered through the bark itself. We found an abandoned campsite beyond, rusted cans of soup, a collapsed tent frame, children's shoes, scuffed, size 3, striped, and a battered tape recorder half buried in pine needles. The cassette inside was unspooled, tape dangling like a wounded heart. Marisol pressed play on her handheld recorder anyway. The thicket erupted in that lullaby whistle, then the sigh, then laughter that rolled and tripled until it filled the forest canopy. The pines shuddered. A twig snapped. We fled, leaving shoes, recorder, and sanity behind. That night at the cabin we listened back. Every device caught the same distortion. A child's lullaby stripped of innocence, pitched down, until it crawled beneath your skin, and the breath, a cavernous exhale that trembled with hunger. We tried to map it. Amplitude shifted every 30 minutes, but over hours it shortened, slipping to 28, then 26 minutes apart. The laughter grew louder, sliding toward the mid-range frequencies that buzzed in your temples. Sleep was impossible. At 3 a.m, Marisol jerked awake, eyes wild, whispering, "It's here." I blinked against the dark and heard it, a faint whistle seeping through cracked window panes. Then the lullaby in my ears, distant but certain, pulling me down the hallway toward the door. I turned the recorder on, held it at my side, and watched the wavering blue light dance under the doorframe. We drove away at dawn, packed our gear into the car like fleeing thieves. But the recorder stayed in the back seat, still running, still listening. We swore we heard the whistle against the hum of the engine on the looped tracks, but at some point we lost track of distance and time. Weeks later, I dug the recorder from a box in my closet, curious, maybe stupid, and hit play. The lullaby hissed through the tiny speaker, slow and tremulous. Then the sigh, and that laughter, only this time it whispered my name. I snapped the sieve. Recorder off and threw it in the dumpster behind the studio. The last I saw of it, it was half buried in grease and crumpled papers, still blinking. But the whistle never left me. It comes in dreams, a low note drifting through half-remembered corridors. Sometimes I catch it in the office, a soft promise. At 1:30 or 2:02 or 2:17, I clap my hands over my ears, but the walls hum with it. This morning my phone buzzed precisely 30 minutes ago with a voicemail I didn't save. My voice came through, but strained, pitched low, singing that twisted lullaby as a child might, then breathing out into laughter. I replayed it until the battery died. Now I wait, eyes on the clock, heart on the loose tick between each minute, because I know what's coming. And when I hear the whistle at precisely 8:30, I'll open the door and step into the pines, whispering back, "I'm coming." And I'll laugh to see what happens next. They cruised down the county road in Mason's rusty Ford pickup, headlights slicing through a bank of fog that drifted up from the limestone fissure known as Devil's Sinkhole. The engine's growl was drowned by cicadas and the whisper of ash juniper needles in the stiff night breeze. Mason glanced at Liz in the passenger seat, her jaw clenched, eyes bright with excitement and something else he couldn't name. In the back seat, Eduardo fumbled with a flashlight and his phone, ready to record whatever prank they had planned. They'd come half believing the old legend that if you shouted into the sinkhole at midnight, you'd hear your own echo. If you were really brave, you'd hear something else. Mason didn't know why they'd agreed to this dare, but once the sun had disappeared behind the hills, they'd driven straight here, drawn by the thrill of something dangerous and inexplicable. They parked where the gravel turned into bare, red dirt, and all three tumbled out into the hush. The world felt thin here, as if reality had thinned to a fragile membrane above a yawning void. The full moon was a pale coin in the sky, and the ring of dead cedar trees around the sinkhole cast long, trembling shadows. They stood at the lip, hearts hammering, cameras rolling. A pair of barred owls called distantly, and the wind shifted, carrying a faint sulfur tang. Mason thought he heard breathing echo back at him, soft and deliberate, but when he pointed it out, Liz shrugged and said it was nothing. Still, the air was heavier here, and the ground smelled of wet earth and something sour, like the aftertaste of decay. When the clock in Mason's phone ticked to 12 a.m., they leaned forward and shouted together, "Halloo!" Their voices ricocheted off unseen walls in the darkness below, then stopped. Silence stretched past 5 seconds, 10 seconds, then a whisper crawled up out of the hole, so faint they had to lean in just to catch it. "Don't come back." It wasn't Mason's voice, and it wasn't Liz's or Eduardo's. It was lower, gravely, as though an old man were rasping through dry lungs. The words came slow and deliberate, each syllable dragging like mud. For a moment, no one moved. Then Liz giggled an edge of hysteria in her laugh, but when Eduardo played back the recording, his face drained of color. The whisper was there, unmistakable, warning them in a voice older than the hillside itself. Liz stepped closer to the edge, peering down into the black maw where her flashlight beam vanished into nothing. Mason grabbed her sleeve. "Don't." She lifted her chin defiantly. "What? I want to see it." Her light flickered as if someone else had punched the batteries. Mason scoured the rim for a hand or a face, but all he saw was a shifting haze of darkness. Eduardo crept forward, camera trained on the void, breath shallow. Then the darkness sighed, an exhale so loud it rattled their teeth and set the flashlight beam swinging. It sounded like a living thing, lungs filling, ready to speak. Liz stumbled back, tripping over a rock. Mason caught her arm, yanking her to safety. Eduardo fumbled for his phone again, but it slipped and shattered on the stones below with a soft final clink. They backed away, hearts racing. The sigh came again, impossibly close this time, more than a sound of pressure that pressed behind their ribs. Mason nearly lost his footing when something brushed his calf, but he spun and found nothing there. Liz was trembling, silent. Eduardo was pale, staring at the sinkhole as if he expected something to rise. The whisper returned, this time in a rush of words so many they jumbled together. "Stay with me forever." Then silence so complete it felt like water. The moon wavered behind a cloud, and the night seemed to fold in on itself. Mason tugged at his friends. "We go, now." They stumbled back to the truck under a sky that had grown unnaturally still, as if the world were holding its breath. Mason jammed the keys in and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life and they peeled away, tires spitting gravel. In the cab, Liz reached for her phone and replayed the audio. The whisper came clear, a voice that should not exist, an invitation and a threat. "I'm here," it said, and then softer, "I'm hungry." Eduardo kicked at the floor mat, face twisting in nausea. Mason kept his eyes on the road. The beam of headlights cut through the fog, but behind them, at the edge of the ditch, he swore he saw a dark shape crouched by the sinkhole's mouth, staring at them with empty eyes. He blinked and it was gone, but he felt its gaze burn into his back seat like a brand. They didn't speak until the highway lights of town shimmered ahead. Then Eduardo said, voice shaking, "What did we do?" Mason forced a laugh too loud and said, "Nothing we can't fix." But the truth clung to his throat. They'd disturbed something deep beneath the earth, something that watched and waited. That night, each of them tossed and turned, haunted by dreams of gaping darkness and that low voice calling their names. When morning came, none of them had the courage to talk about what they'd heard. Yet the warning echoed in their minds. Don't come back. Days passed and the memory faded, but the edges of reality had frayed. Mason noticed shadows that moved at the edge of his vision, always whispering. Liz found messages scratched in her mirror at dawn. Here. Eduardo's recording of the sinkhole grew longer every time he listened, new words embedded between the static. Join me. They agreed to stay away, to pretend it had been a prank. But a dare is a chain, you can't break it once you've picked it up. The sinkhole called them, an itch under their skin. Only Liz had the nerve to go back alone 6 nights later. Mason got a call at 2 of her screaming into the phone. It's not water or wind. It's alive. He grabbed his keys and raced out, heart pounding, but Liz hung up before he could ask where she was. He drove out to the old road, tires crunching on gravel, fear gnawing in his gut. The silence swallowed the engine's roar. When he got to the sinkhole, he found Liz's phone on the ground, still recording. Mason flipped it open. A voice came through, soft and insistent. Mason. Followed by Liz's shriek, cut off by a splintering sound. He knelt at the lip and shone his flashlight down. In the beam he saw her just beyond reach, a silhouette. Pressed against the side of the hole, limbs scuttling like roaches. Her face was turned away, body contorted against the rock, as though she were trying to climb out and climb in at the same time. Her hair billowed around her head like smoke. She looked over her shoulder and met his eyes. Her mouth hung open in a grin too wide, too wet, revealing teeth that flickered red in the light. Mason, she croaked, voice layered with another timbre he knew too well, Eduardo's calm tone, dripping with invitations. Come closer. The earth around her mouth seemed to pulse, as if the sinkhole itself had come alive in Liz's body. Mason backed away, stumbling, hands shaking. She rose a hand and beckoned. He threw the phone at the ground and turned to run, but the darkness followed him, exhaling in his ear. Don't be alone. He didn't look back until he was in the cab of his truck, breathing so hard his ribs ached. He drove away under the indifferent moon. When he reached his porch, he let himself in, locked the door, and sank against it. Only then did he realize he'd left the keys in the ignition. That night, in the empty house, he heard the whisper again, unmistakable and cold against his skin. I'm here. And somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, something exhaled. Emily had arrived at Pedernales Falls late in the afternoon, the sun dipping behind the cedar-studded hill country, turning the limestone ledges to a honeyed glow, while the water below churned and thrashed over stones worn smooth by centuries of rain and flash floods. She had come alone, driven by a mix of curiosity and dread after hearing whispers of a ghostly presence that haunted the canyon's twisted limbs. The stifling heat clung to her like a wet blanket, and every footstep she took crunched against the bleached rocks with a sound too loud for a place this empty. Cicadas buzzed in the treetops, their song a relentless drone that set her nerves on edge, and somewhere upstream a fish slapped the surface, the sound choking off like a dying breath. She paused beneath a gnarled live oak, its roots clawing. at the earth and wiped sweat from her brow, the dampness leaving a salty sting on her skin. She had heard that people came here years ago to swim, to picnic on the ledges, but something had gone wrong. Something that left a mark on the land, a sorrow that pooled in the curves of the river and seeped into the trees. As she stepped back onto the path that wound along the falls, she spotted it, a drab, off-white sheet hanging from a low branch, flapping in the breeze like a silent sentinel. It was the only thing that moved in the hush, and for a moment she thought it might be laundry left behind by campers, but the edges were ragged, streaked with mud, and the air around it felt colder, as though it drank warmth from the world. Emily approached with measured steps, each one echoing hollowly on the rock, her pulse thrumming in her ears, drowning out the cicadas for a heartbeat. The sheet snapped gently in the wind, and she reached out a trembling hand to brush aside the fabric, but before her fingers could touch it, the blanket lifted, dropping away with a soft thud that reverberated like a whispered warning. Beneath the cloth lay the muddy imprint of two small hands, the fingers splayed and smeared, pressed against the damp backside of the sheet, as though a child had leaped against it moments before. The mud was still wet, and bits of leaf litter clung to the smudged outlines, making it impossible to tell how long the prints had been there or what had made them. Emily's stomach clenched, a hollow ache forming in her gut, and she knelt to examine the handprints, half expecting them to vanish or to find something else lurking in the shadows. Instead, she felt something brush her calf, a light, skittering touch that sent a jolt through her spine, and she jerked upright, her eyes darting to the undergrowth. The trees stood motionless, their leaves unmoving, and the wind carried no sound except the distant roar of water. She swallowed, her throat tight, and forced herself to stand, but the moment she did, a soft, childlike giggle drifted down from the pines, a single note that hung in the air like a promise. She spun in a slow circle, scanning every branch, every shadow, but the forest remained still, as though holding its breath. A second laugh echoed, low and hesitant, and then another, whispered and broken, as though whoever laughed was uncertain they should do so. "Hello?" Emily called, her voice brittle, breaking the unnatural quiet with a sound she almost didn't recognize as her own. She waited, her skin prickling, convinced she would see a small figure standing just beyond the pool of sunlight, but nothing moved. She took a step away from the sheet, planning to find a safer vantage point, but the ground beneath her gave way with a soft crack, and she fell, sprawling forward onto the limestone. The impact drove the wind from her lungs, and when she scrambled to her knees, she saw a thin trickle of water seeping from a crack in the stone, carrying tiny droplets of mud that glistened in the dying light. A strand of her hair fell across her face, and she brushed it aside, blinking against tears she refused to let fall. She forced herself to stay calm, to rationalize the handprints and the giggles as tricks of the light and echoes of past visitors, even though her instincts screamed otherwise. The breeze lifted again, sliding through the trees with a temperature that felt ancient, as though the air carried memories of something long gone. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, though it did nothing to warm her, and scanned the ridge. Above, where dark shapes of cedars and junipers stood like silent guardians. She thought she saw a flash of movement high in the branches, but when she tried to focus, the spot was empty. As though her mind played tricks on her, panic nudged at the corners of her awareness, a creeping awareness that she was not alone, that something waited just out of sight. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to step backward, to reclaim the path leading to safety, but her boots slipped on moss and she almost fell again. The river's roar grew louder, as though it wanted her to hear it, to remind her of the power it wielded, the lives it had taken. A memory brushed her mind, an old article she read about a boy who drowned here 30 years ago. His body never recovered. A mother who wandered these same rocks, calling his name until she vanished into the woods. Emily pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to silence the thoughts, but the giggles returned, closer now, as though coming from behind her. She dared to look, angling her head, and saw a pale shape slipping between the trunks, a child's outline that blurred and flickered like a dying flame. She blinked, and it was gone, but she heard the water hiss, a low, guttural sound that was not natural. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding, and crashed against the trunk of a tree. Feeling the rough bark press into her shoulder, she realized then that the sheet had lifted itself entirely, drifting to the ground as though laid aside by invisible hands. She turned to look, and the blanket lay there, a still, pale figure beneath the branch, the handprints no longer visible. Emily crouched, ducking beneath the branch, and ran a shaking hand over the fabric, half expecting to feel the warmth of a living child, but she touched only damp cotton. She pulled the sheet closer, intending to wrap it around her arm so she could carry it away, but as she gathered it, a sudden heaviness settled over her chest, and a voice, soft and young, whispered her name. Emily. The single syllable slid into her mind, intimate and impossible, filling her ears even as her eyes closed in disbelief. She dropped the sheet, which fell with a flop onto the moss, and pressed her palms to her ears, trying to block the sound, but the whisper came again, more urgent, taunting. Emily, help me. Her blood froze, fear tightening around her like a vice, and she stumbled backward, her fingers scrabbling for the cylinder of her flashlight. She found it in her jacket pocket and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the gloom with a narrow shaft of brightness. The light illuminated the rocks and ferns, the braided roots of trees, but nothing moved except the sheet, which quivered as though alive. She raised the flashlight, directing it toward the branch, and although the source of the whisper was invisible, she sensed eyes watching her from the shadows. She took a step forward, heart thundering, and the sheet bolted upward, wrapping itself around her arm with a sudden lunge that nearly knocked her over. She yelped and dropped the flashlight, plunging her into darkness, the beam dancing erratically across rocks. She yanked at the sheet, clawing at the damp fabric, but it resisted, tightening around her wrist as though it clung with bone-chilling intent. She kicked, trying to break free, and her boots struck something solid, the sound echoing like a drumbeat. She shoved the fabric away and stood, panting, the wind swirling, pulling at her hair and clothing. She snatched up the flashlight and swept the beam around, revealing nothing but the twisted shadows of scraggly trees. She realized the giggles had stopped, replaced by a low, mournful cry that rose and fell like the wind itself. She shivered, knowing she should run, but her legs felt rooted, her thoughts scattered by the unearthly sound. Then the cry coalesced into a child's voice sobbing, raw and broken, pleading for help. Emily blinked, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she took a step toward the branch, drawn by a compulsion she didn't understand. Each step felt like wading through molasses, the ground sucking at her boots, slowing her escape. When she reached the branch, she looked up, and the sheet hung once more, swaying gently as though nothing had happened. She swallowed, her throat raw, and brushed her fingers under the edge, revealing the handprints again, perfectly preserved in mud. Only now the prints seemed deeper, as though someone pressed their palms into her dreams, claiming space in her mind. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her eyelids she saw a child's face emerging from the water, pale hair drifting around a small skull, eyes open and blank. She stumbled backward, her pulse a drum in her head, and when she opened her eyes, the forest was empty, silent, but for the distant roar of the river. She turned to leave, pushing through the ferns, her flashlight beam bouncing across the stones, but she heard a whisper behind her, "Don't go." She froze, her hand on a trunk, and though she longed to tear herself away, she felt rooted. bound by something ancient and cruel. The river behind her thundered, the sound building to a frenzy, and she knew if she didn't escape now, she never would. She yanked free from the tree and fled, her boots slipping on wet rock as she raced. Away from the branch, the sheet, the voice. The forest blurred, the cicada shrieked, and the river's roar swallowed everything else until she burst onto solid ground, the path to the parking lot stretching ahead like salvation. She didn't stop until the headlights of her car were in view, the asphalt hot under her feet, the world returning to its ordinary guise. She collapsed against the door, gasping, the whistle of her breath mingling with the engine hum. She looked back once, through the trees, but the forest stood motionless, concealing its secret. She started the car and drove away, the road winding. Through the hill country, the headlights cutting ribbons of light into the night. But as she sped down the highway, she felt the weight of something in the back seat, and although she dared not look, she could sense the outline of the sheet, folded neatly as though waiting, and beneath it, she heard a soft, childlike sigh. The first night beside Devil's River feels impossibly still, as though the world has paused to watch. The air hangs heavy with humidity, clinging to your skin like a damp sheet, and the crickets drone low, a single unbroken note that thrums through your bones. Upstream, the river mutters over stones soft at first, then rising in a rumble that echoes against the limestone banks. You set your headlamp on the log between your knock-off Riat pack and the cooler where you left last. Night's beers, and settle back onto your sleeping pad, feeling the rough bark of the log through your sleeve. There's no wind, yet the mosquito netting above you flutters, as if someone just brushed past the campsite. A crack of wood beneath your elbow makes you sit up. In the half-light, shadows dance, the trees shifting like silent witnesses. You? Tell yourself it's just the camp chair settling, but your chest tightens when you hear it. The faint tap of footsteps, coming from downriver, then upriver, circling closer with every pause. Tap, pause, tap, pause. At first you think it's 1 foot striking flat rock, then a second, an echo of the first. You reach out to adjust your headlamp, heart thudding so hard you swear the echo is matching your pulse. You click it on and swing the beam toward the tree line. The light lances through the darkness, illuminating the underbrush, the helter-skelter tangle of roots and briars, but no one stands there. Nothing moves. You stand, the beam trembling in your grip, and step off the blanket onto the dusty ground. Your boot sinks slightly into the red clay, and you color up a strand of Spanish moss as it brushes your shoulder. The footsteps come again, louder now, as though circled in closer, and you swing the light all around over the riverbank, across the narrow ribbon of beach, into the skeletal arms of the sycamores. You catch your reflection in the water for an instant, pale face framed by the lamplight, dog-tired eyes wide. You shout, "Who's there?" Your voice sounds small. A single echo answers, but it's not your shout. It's a heartbeat, quick and thin, the thrum of life, then silence. They're not with you. You were camping with your sister, Amber. Her name tastes like metal on your tongue. You left her asleep in the tent 5 minutes ago, promising to finish gathering firewood. Only you didn't gather wood. You never moved from that log. You almost stumble back, remembering her soft snores, the unfamiliar scuff of her boots on the ground. You've got to be imagining it. It's the river, or an animal. Coyotes, maybe. You shine the light across the sand. You half expect to see, eyes catching the glow. Nothing. A crackle in your radio, as though someone flipped the switch. You swipe it on, static. Your own name drifts through, low and urgent, as though coming from underwater. Help me. It's Amber's voice, trembling. Help me. You scamper backward toward the tent. Your boots kick up grit that sprays against the tent's polyester side. You dim the beam and peer inside. She's not there. The bedroll is cold and empty, her boots still by the door. Nothing moved when you left. You yank the flap open. The marks into the darkness beyond the mesh. No amber, no sign of life. Just the thick night, swallowing sound. Panic hammers in your chest. You shout her name, voice breaking. From out on the river comes a soft clap, like a solitary hand striking. Another in slow applause. Then another. Clap, clap. It circles, moving around the campsite, closer each time. You grip your flashlight so hard the knuckles whiten, and you spin in place, trying to face the sound. It comes from behind you now, just beyond the radius of the light, where the trees grow thick. You step backward and feel the ground slope. Downward. It's slick with algae. You almost slip. You stand frozen, and the clapping stops. A new sound fills the air. A low gurgle, like water draining. Then footsteps. You can't tell how many, but they follow you one behind the other. Careful, measured. Your heart roars in your ears. Sweat drips down your neck. You raise the lamp and flick it on at full power, sweeping across the stones. There's no one, only your own shadow, stretched long and stuttering. You realize with a sick jolt, the echoes have always matched your pace, your cadence. They're tied to you, bound to your feet. You run. You bolt toward the truck parked on the rough trail, tires caked in mud. Your lamplight catches the gleam of the tailgate. You yank the door open, hop inside, and slam it shut. The cavernous cab is stale with old leather smell and the faint tang of gas. You jump in the driver's seat, fishing your keys out of your pocket. The steps come to the door, slow, deliberate. Footfalls pressed against the metal, tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Your hands shake so badly you can barely insert the key. You jab at the ignition. The beast of an engine roars to life. You press your foot to the accelerator. The tire spins, biting at the gravel. You peel out, fishtailing, and point toward the narrow road that leads back to pavement. Behind you, the riverbank recedes, the trees whipping past, and still the footsteps echo, coming from the river's edge, but keeping stride with the rattling of your door as you speed away. The lights of town appear like fireflies over the ridge. You pull into the only open gas station, tires screeching. The attendant looks up, eyes sleepy. Your headlamp clatters to the floor. You snatch it up and clamber from the cab, throwing open the passenger door half, expecting to see someone slip. Out, nothing. The attendant watches you puzzled as you charge around the truck. No amber, no echo. You jerk the radio off its mount and dial the emergency channel, voice raw. My sister's missing. She was right here. We were camping at Devil's River. She's gone. Please, you have to. You trail off, head snapping. To the tree line behind the station. Something moves in the shadowed pines, a dark shape like a person pausing. You raise your lamp, nothing but a swing of branches. The attendant comes outside, flashlight in hand. You okay? He's middle-aged, grizzled, with a crease in his forehead that seems permanent. You search his face, desperate. Please, you whisper. I heard footsteps. We were here, and now. She's gone, he swallows. This road's been closed on the other side. They found a car half submerged downriver, no one inside. They pulled 2 bodies out this afternoon. Folks say they hear echoes at night, footsteps circling the old campsite. Some nights, they say, the echoes wear boots. A cold sickness grips you. You set the lamp on the pump, beam flickering as you back away. Who were they? He shrugs. Hikers a month back. Couple from Houston. Never made it to town. Found him downstream, battered by rapids. But some of us think they never left the campsite. Just followed their own echoes until they stepped off the bank. Your breath comes in shards. You taste iron. You slide back into the truck, engine idling, blinking hazard lights. The station's gleaming fluorescent stab at the dark. You triangular and drive back toward the river, heart pounding so loud you swear the footsteps will follow. You into town. At the turnoff you pause, headlights cutting through the night air. You scan the bank. Beyond the tree line, the river glints faintly. The world is silent for a heartbeat. Then, far off, from under the bridge, a single clap echoes slow, deliberate, matching the rhythm of your pulse. You leave the headlamp on the dashboard and step out. Your boots crunch on stones. You lift your headlamp, pointing it at the water. No wind, no movement. The echoes come again, a patter of steps circling behind you, matching your sway through the beam. You whirl around. A figure stands at the river's edge, pale, drenched, face slack with water. Amber silhouette, backlit by moonlight, steps forward. Come back, she whispers in your own voice. Her lips move slow. Help me. The lamplight catches eyes wide with fear. You step toward her, then realize her feet sink into the crawfish-studded mud. With a single clap that bursts like a gunshot in the still night, the echoes fall silent. You take one step. The earth gives way. You plunge into icy water. You reach up, mouthful of river, desperate for solid ground. You come up choking, only to find you're alone out when they find your boots on the riverbank. Headlamps still strapped and glowing, the echoes will chase them too, matching their heartbeats, until they step off into the dark and become one more whisper tangled in devils. River. The night air in the Franklin Mountains smelled of dry sage and cold stone. Mia and Sarah had pitched their tent just below a jagged outcrop of granite, its silhouette black against a sky crowded with stars. They'd driven in that afternoon, down a narrow dirt road lined with cholla and ocotillo until the engine threatened to stall on the steep clay incline. By the time they unpacked their gear, the sun had dipped behind distant red mesas, leaving only a thin line of golden light on the horizon. They cooked their stew over a flickering camp stove, the flame hissing as distant coyotes answered each other in mournful howls. When the fire died, they went to sleep to the sound of wind slipping through the branches of piñon pines, and somewhere, far off, the grinding scrape of rocks shifting on rock. Mia woke first, sometime before dawn, to the ting tinzanonbam, soft patter of her own heartbeat. She felt the chill in the air seep through her sleeping bag and pushed aside the zipper. Outside the tent, the world was gray and silent, a hush broken only by the shallow whisper of dawn's wind. She saw movement beyond the tent flap, a dozen stick figures arranged in a rough circle around their nylon shelter. They stood motionless, their slender limbs formed of dried twigs balanced on small piles of stones. Each had one arm extended, a single twig pointing directly toward the tent's entrance, like silent sentinels warning intruders to stay away. Mia stared for a long moment, unable to believe what she saw. The figures were too precise, too deliberate. To be random debris. Sarah, she murmured, voice trembling. Come look at this. Sarah blinked awake, hair matted to her forehead, and unzipped her side of the tent. She gasped, then stifled the sound, her hand pressed to Mia's arm. In the faint light, the stick figures took on a menacing geometry, their spindly fingers accusing them of trespassing on something ancient and furious. Neither remembered hearing footsteps or seeing anyone nearby, and the ground around the figures was smooth, unmarked by boots or tire tracks. They crawled out, boots crunching on gravel, hearts thudding in their chests. Mia's hand trembled as she snapped photos with her phone, each click echoing in the still morning. Sarah knelt beside one of the figures, running her gloved hand along its hip, half expecting the twigs to snap or some hidden mechanism to whir. But the sticks were brittle and bone dry, and there was no trace of footprints. No clue who had placed them or why. A question charged the air between them, but the desert held its secrets tight, offering only the unsettling tableau of those silent, accusing guardians. They dismantled the nearest figures, stuffing stray twigs into their packs, determined to break the spell of that uncanny vigil. Inside the tent, they searched for tracks or scraps of cloth but found nothing. Sarah suggested they pack up and drive back to El Paso, but Mia hesitated. Their truck was packed with supplies for a week. Of hiking, their food, water, a map scratched with blue lines denoting dreamlike canyons and hidden springs. To abandon it all felt like conceding to whoever, or whatever, had created those figures. By midday, the sun had burned away the chill and baked the stones until the air shimmered above the granite slabs. They climbed the trail toward a small, natural arch they'd marked on the map, hoping distance would clear their heads. But even among the sun-bleached rock, every broken branch or twisted root looked to them like another stick figure waiting to claim them. At moments, they believed they heard faint scraping behind them, a rhythmic tapping like 100 tiny sticks brushing against each other. When they turned, there was only desert. They returned to camp as twilight bled into night, casting the mountains in bruised purples and deepening shadows. Sarah built a small fire, and they sat close, backs against the truck's tailgate, eating cold beans from a can. The flame danced, and the wind carried the scent of smoke into the dark. Mia thought she saw form shifting just beyond the firelight, tall, lean shapes that might have been trees or might have been standing figures. When she tilted her head, they dissolved into the blackness. She drew her jacket tighter around her shoulders, listening to her own breath. They slipped into the tent together, trying to pretend the events of the morning had been a trick of the light or a prank by some passing desert wanderer. Sleep came in fitful bursts, Sarah murmuring the names of their childhood pets, Mia dreaming of twig men rising like marionettes from the earth. Then Sarah woke with a start, whispering, "Did you feel that?" Mia sat up, hand on her flashlight, and heard the scrape of twigs on canvas. Outside, a new circle of stick figures had appeared, almost touching the sides of the tent, pointing inward again. Their arms all converged on the zipper of the tent door. Mia grabbed Sarah's arm. "They moved," she said. "They're closer." They unfurled the tent flap and gaped at the silent worship circle pressing in on them. The ground around the figures showed no sign of disturbance. They held their breath, the tent fabric quivering between them and those lean watchers. Then the coyotes sang out once, a single long howl that seemed to mark a deadline, and the figures remained still. Mia whispered, "We have to go now." Sarah nodded, eyes wide. They stumbled through packing with shaking finger zippers, poles, stakes sliding over each other in that cold night air. The truck roared to life, headlights cutting through darkness. As they backed up, Sarah turned on her phone's video camera, panning across the campsite. Beneath the starlight, more figures emerged along the ridge, dozens of them laid out in perfect rows, heads bowed, each pointing toward the truck's path. The camera's red recording light pulsed like a heartbeat. They barreled down the dirt road, tires throwing gravel into the night until the world flattened into a straight ribbon of road and the mountains dissolved behind them. Sarah reached to stop the recording, but the app had crashed. No video, no photos. Only the memory of shapes moving in the dark. The GPS flickered and died, leaving them blind to their position except for the beam of headlights cutting through. Mesquite and yucca dot as they crossed a small wash. Mia glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. Inside the cab, over the passenger seat, a single stick figure had materialized, perched on the edge of Sarah's seat like a grotesque toy. It pointed one skeletal twig at them, at Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat. Mia swerved to the side of the wash, tires spinning on loose earth. They tumbled out, hearts pounding, flashlights bobbing as they swung the beams toward the figure. It sat still, its twig hand raised in accusation, and they didn't dare touch it. Sarah found her voice. "What is it?" Mia couldn't answer. She stared at that harbinger of splintered wood and silent menace. When the truck was back on the road, they raced toward El Paso, the city lights promising safety. But every mile, every beating second, they felt the gravity of those stick men pulling them back. And in the final moment, as the city sprawl swallowed the truck's headlights, Mia realized she could still feel the weight of that twig finger in the dead of night and unyielding. Accusation that trailed them home, promising they had brought the worshippers with them, whether they knew it or not. The night air in the hill country felt heavier than usual, like the land itself was holding its breath. Sarah and Mike had set up camp just beyond a stand of live oaks, their little two-man tent glowing faintly under the lantern's light. They'd driven in that afternoon, tires crunching limestone, and pitched their tent beside a shallow creek that gurgled over smooth stones. The sky had been clear, a black canvas sprinkled with stars so bright it felt like someone had spilled sugar across the heavens. They'd laughed around a small fire and talked about nothing important: old movies, work projects, the next morning's sunrise, but as soon as the fire died down, the darkness closed in fast and everything felt different. At exactly 3:00, Sarah was the first to notice. Mike had stirred in his sleeping bag, then rolled onto his side, squinting through the tent's mesh window. Outside, a lantern bobbed into view, swinging slowly from side to side, its feeble glow cutting through the trees like a lost soul's lantern in a ghost story. It hovered just at the edge of their clearing, swaying with a deliberate rhythm, as if guided by an unseen hand. Heart pounding, Sarah unzipped the tent flap and stepped out, the air cold enough to steal her breath. Mike followed, grabbing a spare flashlight. "Hello?" Sarah called, voice tight with curiosity and dread. Her words cracked against the silence. The lantern drifted closer, the beam catching on tangled roots and clumps of fallen leaves, but there was no figure carrying it. No stump or branch to hook it on. Nothing but the swinging lantern, the silent trees, and the low croak of distant frogs. Mike clicked on his flashlight and swept it around, illuminating the trunks of oaks, the thick underbrush, but he found nothing, no person, no animal, no discarded pack that might explain how a lantern had come hurtling into their camp. Just empty woods that looked the same as they had at dusk, except now they seemed to lean in, watching. "Joe?" Mike shouted toward their neighbor's camp, which lay maybe 200 yards away through the brush. He and Joe had met earlier in the day, swapping fishing tips and canteen water. Joe was an old-timer, lived in a cabin a few miles off the gravel road. He'd promised to come over later for a beer, but by twilight he'd stayed back by his own fire, nursing a flask and rolling cigarettes. Silence answered. The lantern hung in the air, swinging slower now, as though pausing to listen. Sarah stepped forward, her boots crunching on dead leaves. She reached out and grabbed the lantern's handle. The metal was warm to the touch, humming with residual heat, but still no figure emerged from the darkness. She gripped it tighter, and it stilled, swinging like a pendulum frozen at mid-swing. "We should go look for him," she whispered, handing the lantern to Mike. He gave her a nod that said he was already grabbing his jacket. They moved quietly, flashlights probing the gloom as they edged toward the neighbor's campfire. The embers there were cold, nothing but charred logs and a half-full can of beans. No footprints led away, no overturned brush, no sign that someone had walked through. It was as if Joe had simply evaporated. Then they heard it, a faint scrape, like leather against rock, coming from deeper in the trees. Sarah froze, flashlight beam trembling. Mike swallowed against a dry throat and turned the beam toward the pateo. Sound. For an instant, he thought he saw a dark shape slip behind a mesquite before vanishing. He took a cautious step forward. The beam followed to reveal nothing more than a tangle of limbs. "Over here," Sarah said softly, pointing back toward their own clearing. They hurried back, the strange lantern swinging in Mike's gloved hand. Back at the tent, they searched for their neighbor's boot or any trace of him, but found nothing. Mike set the lantern on a low stump, and they both stood in the dim circle of light, sweat beading on their foreheads despite the chill. "I don't like this," Sarah said, voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get inside." They crawled into the tent together, voices hushed as they reviewed what had happened. The lantern swinging into their camp, the empty woods, the vanished neighbor, the scrape in the darkness. Eyes flicking to the screen while the wind whispered through the trees sounded like distant voices mocking them. They zipped up and lay in their sleeping bags, hearts racing, until exhaustion pulled them under in fitful, dreamless sleep. Morning came in a slow wash of pale pink and gold. Sarah woke first, blinking against the dawn, and saw Mike pale and unsteady as he stood just outside the tent, staring down at something half buried in leaves. She squeezed past him to see what had drawn his gaze. There, at the very edge of their clearing, lay a single boot, one of Joe's heavy leather field boots, crusted with mud. But the sole was clean of last night's dust, and the leather still hummed with warmth, as though it had just slipped off the foot that wore it. Mike's hand hovered over the boot, fingers trembling. "How can it still be warm?" he murmured. Sarah pressed her hand to the leather. It felt almost too hot, pulsing beneath her palm like a faint heartbeat. They exchanged frightened looks. The boot was empty, its mate nowhere in sight. No sock, no foot, just that solitary boot, still warm in the cool morning air. "Mike," Sarah said, her voice cracking, "we have to find Joe." But even as she spoke, her gut screamed that Joe was already gone beyond help, that the boot was a message or a lure. Mike lifted the boot gently, and something caught the light on its sole, an impression, a weird pattern in the worn tread, like the outline of a human face. Sarah squinted, and it seemed to shift, as if the boot's sole had absorbed something dark and alive overnight. They spent the next hour combing the area, calling Joe's name until their throats burned, but only the mocking wind answered. They found no tracks leading away from the boot, only the deep impressions of the boot itself pressed into the soft soil, as if the wearer had stood there, looking into the trees, then vanished right through the ground. Panic settled in their chests like stone. They abandoned the search and pack, opting to drive into town to alert the ranger station. They loaded their packs haphazardly, Mike tossing the still warm boot into Sarah's pack as proof. She hesitated, but nodded before slapping the pack closed. The drive out felt like a dream, tires humming on the gravel, headlights slicing through thinning woods. Sarah watched the boot's silhouette in the glow of the dashboard lights, dread curling in her stomach. She tried to laugh, to reassure herself it was a prank, but the warmth of that boot under her fingers reminded her it was no ordinary trick. They spotted the dusty sign for the ranger station up ahead, a weathered plank, nailed to two posts. Mike killed the engine and they stumbled inside, breathless, telling their story to a tired ranger who scribbled notes without looking up. He raised an eyebrow at the boot, slipped on a durable glove, and examined it in low light. "Where's the other one?" he asked, voice polite but skeptical. "And where's your friend?" He's missing," Mike said, but even he hesitated on the pronoun. "Joe's our neighbor. His lantern came drifting into our camp last night. We called for him, and this morning we found just this boot. It's warm." The ranger set the boot down with a soft thud and locked eyes with them. "You realize I can't launch a search party based on a single boot, right?" He tapped his pen on the desk. "You need more evidence. Tracks, maybe a vehicle, something." "We have the lantern," Sarah piped up, "and Joe's campsite where he was alone." She rattled her bag where the lantern sat rattling softly. The ranger sighed, leaning back. "Bring the lantern and boot in. Fill out the missing person form. But remember, people get lost out there all the time. Without a body, we're limited." They left the station in stunned silence, the lantern and boot tucked in the back seat like sinister souvenirs. On the ride home, Sarah stared through the window at the empty roadway, shoulders tense. She imagined Joe's face, limbs tangled. In the mesquite, or worse, that something had taken him deeper into the dark. The ranch houses thinned, replaced by open fields dotted with wildflowers. A hawk circled overhead, calling out. Back at their own house, safe behind locked doors, they placed the boot and lantern on the kitchen table. The lantern's glass was still warm, though cooled enough to touch. They sat at the table under the bright kitchen light, heart still pounding, ear listening for the sound of footsteps on the porch, of Joe stumbling back. But nothing came. Days passed. The ranger never called. Joe's cabin remained empty, the windows dark. No footprints, no sign of struggle. 3 nights later, at exactly 3 a.m., Sarah woke to a scrape at the kitchen window. Her skin prickled. She nudged Mike, who reached for the baseball bat propped by the door. They crept to the window. Outside, a boot lay in the flower bed, Mike's own work boot, its toe pointed toward the back door. Next to it, pressed into the damp earth, was a message spelled out in smeared mud. "Come back." And above it, dangling from the gutter, swung their neighbor's lantern, its bulb flickering as if breathing. The glass was cracked now, etched with fine lines like veins, and inside, behind the swinging light, Sarah thought she saw a face empty-eyed, pale, pressed against the glass, staring in at them.